The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Route 43, painting the Alabama countryside in hues of fading gold and deepening violet. Clarence Wilton, hand resting lightly on the steering wheel of his late wife's Lincoln, watched the interplay of light and shadow, a familiar comfort in a landscape that held a lifetime of memories, both bitter and sweet. He'd driven this road countless times, each mile etched with the echoes of a past that clung to him like the humid air. The Lincoln, a relic of happier days, purred beneath him, its smooth ride a stark contrast to the sudden, jarring flash of red and blue in his rearview mirror. A knot tightened in his stomach, a reflex honed by years of navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices of the South. He pulled over, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, a sound that seemed amplified in the sudden silence. He took a slow, deliberate breath, reminding himself of who he was, of all he had overcome. He was Clarence Wilton, Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a man of dignity, a man of the law. The young officer approached, his gait stiff, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Clarence watched him in the side mirror, noting the crispness of the uniform, the name tag Cutler and the set of his jaw, a tightness that spoke of impatience, perhaps even something more. He's young, Clarence thought, probably fresh out of the academy. But beneath that initial assessment, a deeper, more weary recognition stirred within him. He'd seen this look before, a look that transcended age or uniform, a look that spoke volumes about the enduring legacy of this land. License and registration. The officer's voice was sharp, clipped, devoid of any semblance of courtesy. Clarence turned to face him, his movements deliberate, slow. "It's in my wallet," he said, his voice calm, measured. "I'll move slow." He knew the drill. Every black man in the South knew the drill. Keep your hands visible. Speak respectfully. Don't make any sudden movements. Survival depended on it. He reached for his wallet, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. Inside, nestled amongst credit cards and family photos, lay his Supreme Court identification. He extracted it carefully, handing it to the officer along with his driver's license. Cutler took the documents, his eyes flicking between the two. A flicker of something: confusion, disbelief, crossed his face, quickly replaced by a mask of suspicion. "Supreme Court?" he scoffed, the word laced with disdain. "What's this? Some kind of joke?" Clarence felt a surge of anger rise within him, hot and potent. Decades of battling injustice, of fighting for equality, flashed before his eyes. He'd stood before presidents, argued before the highest court in the land, and yet, here he was on a dusty road in rural Alabama, being treated like a common criminal. He swallowed the anger, pushing it down, burying it deep. This wasn't the time for righteous indignation. This was a time for survival. "It's not a joke, officer," he said, his voice still even. "It's who I am." Cutler examined the ID again, turning it over in his hands as if it were some strange, foreign object. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken tension. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt, making Cutler's face appear even more angular, his expression unreadable. The cicadas buzzed in the nearby trees, their drone a relentless soundtrack to the unfolding scene. Clarence could smell the dry dust of the road, the faint scent of pine needles from the surrounding woods. He could feel the weight of the officer's gaze, heavy and oppressive. His heart beat steadily, a quiet drumbeat against the backdrop of his own rising anxiety. He wondered what was going through the young officer's mind, what preconceived notions were clouding his judgment. Did he see a Supreme Court justice or just another black man in a fancy car? Cutler finally handed the documents back, his movements jerky, almost reluctant. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," he said, his voice still tight with suspicion. Clarence hesitated. He knew his rights, knew he didn't have to comply, but he also knew the potential consequences of resistance. He weighed the options in his mind, calculating the risks. He looked at Cutler, at the youthful arrogance etched on his face, and made a decision. He slowly opened the car door, the leather creaking softly in the stillness. He stepped out onto the gravel, feeling the crunch beneath his shoes. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his gaze steady. He would not be intimidated. He would not be broken. Just then, the sound of another vehicle approaching broke the tense silence. A sheriff's department SUV pulled up behind the patrol car, its lights flashing. A middle-aged Hispanic man stepped out, his uniform slightly rumpled, his expression weary. He approached Cutler, his brow furrowed in question. "Everything all right here, Cutler?" he asked, his voice laced with a subtle authority that Cutler clearly lacked. "Just a routine traffic stop, Deputy Morales," Cutler replied, his voice now tinged with a hint of nervousness. He gestured towards Clarence. "This gentleman," he didn't get to finish his sentence. Deputy Morales's eyes had landed on Clarence, and his face transformed. The weariness vanished, replaced by a look of recognition, then respect. "Judge Wilton?" he said, his voice filled with surprise. "Is that you?" Clarence nodded, a small, tight smile playing on his lips. The shift in power was palpable, the air suddenly charged with a different kind of tension. "Judge Wilton?" Morales repeated, turning to Cutler, his voice now sharp with disapproval. "Do you know who this is?" Cutler stammered, his face flushing crimson. "Two. This is Justice Clarence Wilton of the United States Supreme Court," Morales said, his voice ringing with authority. "He doesn't need to explain himself to you." He turned back to Clarence, his demeanor apologetic. "I apologize for this, Judge. I'll handle this." Cutler stood there, speechless, his face a mask of humiliation. The setting sun cast long shadows over the scene, a silent commentary on the unfolding drama. The cicadas continued their relentless drone, a backdrop to the quiet hum of injustice exposed. The encounter, captured on a passing motorist's dashcam, would soon go viral, igniting a firestorm of controversy and sparking a much-needed conversation about racial bias in policing. But for now, in this quiet corner of rural Alabama, Clarence Wilton stood tall, a testament to resilience, a living embodiment of justice prevailing. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the two-lane highway, painting the roadside weeds in hues of amber and ochre. A lone buzzard circled high above, a stark silhouette against the pale canvas of the sky. Justice Clarence Wilton watched it, a strange detachment settling over him as he sat in his Lincoln, the leather cool beneath his palms. He'd driven this road countless times, the familiar Alabama landscape a constant throughout his life. Yet today it felt alien, hostile. The flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror were a harsh, unwelcome punctuation mark in the quiet rhythm of the countryside. He'd been careful, meticulously observing the speed limit. He hadn't changed lanes without signaling, hadn't so much as touched his phone. The reason for the stop, he knew, resided not in his driving but in the color of his skin. This understanding, forged over decades of living in the South, didn't lessen the creeping unease that tightened his chest. It was a weariness that settled deep in his bones, a familiar ghost returning to haunt him. The officer approached, his silhouette a dark outline against the setting sun. Young Wilton noted, the gait stiff, almost robotic. He rolled down his window, the faint whir of the motor a small defiance against the silence that had descended. "License and registration, please," the officer said, his voice clipped, devoid of any trace of Southern hospitality. His name tag read Cutler. Wilton complied, his movements precise, deliberate. He handed over the documents, his fingers brushing against Cutler's. He noticed the subtle flinch, the barely perceptible recoil. He sees my skin before he sees my credentials, Wilton thought, the realization a bitter pill. Cutler examined the documents, his brow furrowed. Wilton watched him, his own expression carefully neutral. Decades on the bench had taught him the value of an impassive facade, a mask to hide the churning emotions beneath. He'd faced down hostile lawyers, endured veiled insults, and navigated the treacherous waters of racial politics. This, he told himself, was just another courtroom. But the gnawing anxiety in his stomach told a different story. "Step out of the vehicle, sir," Cutler said, his voice sharper now, an edge of suspicion tainting his tone. Wilton felt a flicker of anger, a hot spark in his chest. He hadn't done anything wrong. Yet here he was being treated like a common criminal. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain calm. "Officer, is there a problem?" "Just step out of the vehicle, sir," Cutler repeated, his hand resting on his holster. The gesture, seemingly casual, sent a chilling message. Wilton slowly opened the door and stepped out onto the asphalt. The setting sun cast long shadows, making Cutler appear larger than life, a looming figure of authority. Wilton felt the familiar weight of his years, the subtle ache in his joints, a stark contrast to the young officer's raw energy. He stood tall, his back straight, his gaze steady. He would not be intimidated. "What's the reason for this stop, officer?" Wilton asked, his voice even controlled. Cutler didn't answer. Instead, he began a pat-down, his hands rough against Wilton's suit. The humiliation burned, hot and sharp, a deep insult to his dignity. "You don't have a warrant. What you're doing is illegal," Wilton said, his voice still calm, but with an underlying steel. Cutler smirked, a flash of something ugly in his eyes. "Around here, I decide what's legal." Wilton's heart sank. The casual arrogance, the blatant disregard for the law, it was more than just racism. It was a display of power, a raw assertion of dominance. He watched as Cutler proceeded to search his car, rifling through his briefcase, his personal belongings. Each movement felt like a violation, a stripping away of his privacy, his dignity. He knew he should protest, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. A profound sense of weariness washed over him. He'd fought these battles his entire life. How many more times would he have to endure this humiliation? Just as despair began to creep into his heart, headlights appeared in the distance. A sheriff's vehicle pulled up behind Cutler's cruiser, its flashing lights adding another layer of surrealism to the scene. A middle-aged Hispanic man stepped out, his uniform crisp, his demeanor professional. He approached them, his gaze taking in the scene. "Everything all right here, Cutler?" he asked, his voice tinged with a slight accent. Cutler straightened up, his demeanor shifting instantly. "Just a routine traffic stop, Deputy Morales," he said, his voice regaining its official tone. He gestured towards Wilton. "Sir, do you mind showing Deputy Morales your license and registration?" Before Wilton could respond, Deputy Morales's eyes widened in recognition. "Judge Wilton? Is that you?" The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air, thick with tension moments before, now crackled with a different kind of energy. Cutler's face paled. He looked from Wilton to Morales, his eyes darting back and forth like a trapped animal. He stammered, "Judge, I didn't realize." Wilton met Morales's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. He felt a flicker of hope, a small ember of justice igniting in the darkness. The buzzard still circled overhead, but now, the setting sun seemed less ominous, the shadows less menacing. The arrival of Morales, a beacon of fairness in the encroaching twilight, had changed everything. He knew this incident wouldn't erase the deep-seated prejudices that plagued the nation, but for this moment, justice had prevailed. And in that small victory, he found the strength to continue the fight. The weary ghost within him retreated, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. The flashing blue and red lights pulsed against the darkening Alabama sky, painting the dusty roadside in alternating hues of violence and calm. Clarence Wilton sat in his Lincoln, the leather cool beneath his hands. He'd seen this dance before, this ballet of power and prejudice played out on the asphalt stage of the rural South. Decades on the bench, a lifetime spent navigating the labyrinthine legalities of a nation still grappling with its demons, hadn't erased the familiar prickle of apprehension. Comply, Clarence. Comply and survive. The mantra echoed, a ghostly whisper from his ancestors. He watched in the rearview mirror as the young officer approached, his gait stiff, his hand hovering near his holster. This wasn't about a broken taillight. Clarence knew that with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones. The officer's face, when it came into view, was a mask of barely contained aggression. Cutler. The name tag glinted under the flashing lights. His voice, when he spoke, was tight, strained. "License and registration, sir." The "sir" felt like an afterthought, a grudging concession. Clarence handed over the documents, his movements deliberate, slow. Each gesture, each breath was a calculated maneuver in a game with stakes he knew all too well. Don't react, Clarence. Don't give him the satisfaction. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the forced calmness of his exterior. Cutler scrutinized the documents, his lips moving silently. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of highway traffic. Clarence could smell the dust and pine needles, the familiar scent of the Alabama countryside, a scent that had once held the promise of freedom and now felt tainted with the bitter tang of injustice. He saw the flicker of something in Cutler's eyes, suspicion, perhaps, or something darker, something that made Clarence's stomach clench. He'd seen that look before. It was the look of a man clinging to a fragile power, a power threatened by the very presence of a black man in a luxury car. The sudden glare of headlights cut through the darkness. Another vehicle. Clarence felt a flicker of hope, a fragile ember in the oppressive night. The vehicle pulled up behind the patrol car, its own lights flashing, but these were amber, not red and blue. A sheriff's vehicle. Cutler straightened, his posture shifting subtly, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his rigid stance. A man emerged from the sheriff's vehicle, his movements fluid, his demeanor calm. He was Hispanic, middle-aged, his uniform crisp and clean. He approached Cutler, his gaze shifting between the young officer and Clarence's car. "Everything all right here, Officer Cutler?" His voice was smooth, even. Cutler turned, his face flushed. "Just a routine traffic stop, Deputy Morales." Subject wasn't complying. The lie hung in the air, thick and palpable. Clarence watched the exchange in the rearview mirror, his mind racing. Complying with what? Existing? The thought was bitter, sharp. Morales glanced at Clarence's car, then back at Cutler. He took a step closer, peering into the Lincoln. His eyes widened slightly, a beat of silence. Then, in a voice filled with a mixture of respect and disbelief, he said, "Judge Wilton." The name hung in the air, a sudden shift in the gravitational pull of the scene. Clarence saw Cutler's face pale. The young officer's bravado seemed to evaporate, replaced by a dawning realization of the magnitude of his mistake. The air crackled with unspoken tension. Clarence slowly opened his car door and stepped out, his movements deliberate and dignified. He met Morales's gaze, a flicker of something weariness, perhaps, or resignation passing between them. "Deputy Morales," Clarence acknowledged, his voice calm and steady. Morales turned to Cutler, his expression hardening. "Judge Wilton? You pulled over Judge Wilton for not complying." The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Cutler stammered, I didn't recognize him, sir." The "sir" now dripped with a different kind of weight, the weight of a subordinate caught in a blatant act of misconduct. Morales shook his head, his disappointment palpable. He turned back to Clarence, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I apologize for this, Judge. This is unacceptable." He gestured towards Cutler, his eyes narrowed. "Officer Cutler will be dealt with." Clarence nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. He didn't need an apology. He needed change. He needed a world where his skin color didn't make him a target. He looked at Cutler, the young officer's face a mask of shame and fear. He saw the fear, but he didn't see understanding. Not yet. He knew this incident would become another statistic, another anecdote in the ongoing narrative of racial injustice. He knew it would be dissected, analyzed, and debated. He knew it would likely go viral, adding fuel to the already raging fire of public discourse. But in this moment, on this dusty roadside in rural Alabama, all he felt was a profound weariness, a weariness that settled deep in his soul, a heavy weight he knew he would carry for the rest of his days. He got back into his car, the leather cool against his skin, a stark contrast to the burning anger that simmered beneath the surface. The amber and blue lights faded into the darkness as he drove away, leaving behind a scene that would replay in his mind, a constant reminder of the battles still to be fought. The quiet hum of the engine was a counterpoint to the roaring storm within. He knew this wasn't over. It never was. The flashing blue and red lights pulsed against the darkening Alabama sky, painting the roadside in alternating washes of violent color. Clarence Wilton sat in his car, the leather cool against his skin, the scent of pine needles and damp earth drifting in through the cracked window. He watched Deputy Morales, a man built like a weathered oak, his face etched with the lines of long days under the southern sun. Circle Officer Cutler. The young officer, barely out of his teens, Wilton guessed, stood stiffly, his shoulders squared in a posture of defiance that seemed almost comical against the older man's quiet authority. Wilton had seen this kind of defiance before. It was a brittle shell, easily cracked by the weight of consequence. Morales' voice, though calm, carried an undercurrent of steel. "What exactly did you stop him for, officer?" Cutler shifted his weight, the movement betraying a sudden nervousness. He tugged at the brim of his hat, a gesture Wilton recognized as an attempt to mask unease. He knows he's in trouble, Wilton thought, a flicker of grim satisfaction rising within him. He just doesn't know how much yet. A lifetime spent navigating the treacherous currents of Southern justice had taught Wilton patience. He could wait. He was driving slow, acting suspicious, Cutler muttered, the words swallowed by the evening air. Morales' eyebrows rose, a slow, deliberate movement. Wilton could almost hear the gears turning in the deputy's mind, piecing together the puzzle. Suspicious how? Cutler's gaze darted towards Wilton's car, a flicker of something akin to fear crossing his face. Wilton met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. He knew what Cutler saw: a black man, elderly but still possessing a quiet strength, a man who wouldn't be easily intimidated, a man who knew his rights. Just suspicious, Cutler repeated, his voice lacking conviction. He avoided Morales' eyes, focusing instead on a point somewhere beyond the deputy's shoulder. He knew he'd stumbled into something he didn't understand, a situation far more complex than a simple traffic stop. His youthful arrogance was beginning to crumble under the weight of the situation. Too late, son, Wilton thought, a bitter taste rising in his throat. Too late to back down now. Morales' silence hung heavy in the air, thick with unspoken accusation. He took a slow, deliberate step closer to Cutler, the movement subtly predatory. Driving slow is not a crime, officer, especially not on these back roads. Especially not at this time of night. Cutler swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for the right words, the words that would somehow justify his actions, erase the suspicion in Morales' eyes. The words wouldn't come. He had built his case on a foundation of prejudice, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. Inside his car, Wilton watched the scene unfold, his heart a steady drum against his ribs. He had hoped this day would never come, that his position would shield him from this kind of blatant discrimination. He'd been wrong, but he was also strangely calm. He had faced worse. He had survived worse. This he would survive too. "Look," Cutler finally stammered, his voice cracking under the pressure. I mean, with the recent break-ins around here," his voice trailed off, the excuse flimsy and unconvincing. Even he could hear the hollowness of his own words. Morales' face remained impassive. He reached for his radio, his fingers clipping the microphone. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Morales. Badge number 427. Need Sheriff Thompson out on County Road 47, near the old Miller place. Got a situation here." He paused, his eyes fixed on Cutler, a silent message passing between them. A situation involving Officer Cutler. Badge number 119. Cutler's face paled. He understood the implication. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was an official incident, one that would be documented, investigated. His career, barely begun, was suddenly teetering on the precipice. He wanted to speak, to explain, to beg, but the words caught in his throat, choked by a rising tide of panic. Wilton watched Cutler's distress with a mixture of pity and contempt. Pity because the young man was clearly out of his depth, caught in a web of his own making. Contempt because the web was woven with threads of prejudice, threads that had entangled countless black lives before his. He needs this lesson, Wilton thought, a hard knot forming in his stomach. He needs to understand. As Morales spoke into the radio, detailing the location and the situation, Wilton leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes. He could feel the tension radiating off Cutler, the palpable fear emanating from the young officer. He could hear the crickets chirping in the nearby woods, the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. He could smell the damp earth, the pine needles, the faint metallic scent of fear. And beneath it all, he could feel the slow, steady churn of justice, grinding its way forward, inevitable, inexorable. The tires crunched on the gravel driveway, a familiar sound that usually brought a sense of peace. Tonight, it was a stark reminder of the ground beneath him, the solid reality that contrasted sharply with the unsettling encounter he'd just endured. He switched off the ignition, the sudden silence amplifying the drumming in his ears. Clarence Wilton, Supreme Court Justice, felt the weight of the world settle on his shoulders, heavier than the black robes he wore in court. He sat for a moment, the leather of the steering wheel cool against his palm. He inhaled deeply, the scent of pine needles and damp earth doing little to soothe the tremor in his hand. 72 years, he thought, 72 years in this country, and still the house stood silent, a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't wanted to burden his wife with the fresh sting of this latest indignity. He knew she would fret, her worry lines deepening like the cracks in the parched earth during a summer drought. Unlocking the front door, he stepped inside, the soft click echoing the quiet beat of his own heart. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of lavender and old books. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, seeking the solace he usually found within these walls. Yet, even here, the echoes of the young officer's voice, laced with suspicion and barely concealed contempt, reverberated in his mind. "License and registration, sir." Such simple words, yet they carried the weight of generations of prejudice. He moved through the dimly lit hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Each step felt heavy, each breath a conscious effort. In the living room, the muted glow of the television screen cast flickering shadows on the walls. He hadn't even bothered to turn it on. It was the silence he craved, a space to process the emotions churning within him. He sank into his favorite armchair, the worn leather conforming to his body like an old friend. But comfort was elusive tonight. His phone buzzed, a persistent vibration against the fabric of his pocket. He didn't reach for it. He knew. He knew what awaited him: the concerned inquiries, the expressions of outrage, the inevitable requests for statements, for interviews, for him to do something. He closed his eyes, rubbing his temples with his thumb and forefinger. Black men in America don't get to panic. They don't get to shout. They don't get to be anything but impeccably calm, meticulously reasonable, lest they be perceived as the threat the prejudiced mind already believes them to be. The exhaustion was bone deep, a weariness that seeped into his very soul. Another buzz, then another. The phone vibrated insistently, a relentless reminder of the world outside, a world that wouldn't let him retreat into the quiet sanctuary of his home. He finally pulled it out, the screen illuminating his face with a ghostly glow. A flurry of notifications, text messages, missed calls. His hand trembled slightly as he scrolled through the messages. His name repeated over and over. The incident, the video. His breath caught in his throat. He hadn't even realized how. How had it spread so fast? He clicked on the link, his heart pounding against his ribs. The grainy footage flickered to life, the scene unfolding before his eyes as if he were living it all over again. The flashing blue and red lights, the young officer's aggressive stance, his own measured responses. He watched himself, a detached observer of his own humiliation. He could hear the officer's voice, the condescending tone, the implied accusations. And then, the arrival of Deputy Morales, the shift in the officer's demeanor, the sudden realization of his mistake. The look on Cutler's face, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and a flicker of fear. It was a fleeting moment, quickly replaced by a mask of forced professionalism. He closed his eyes, the image burned into his mind. He could feel the shame rising within him, a hot, bitter tide. Not shame for himself, but shame for the system, for the ingrained prejudice that allowed such encounters to happen time and time again. The video played on, the sound muted, but the narrative clear. The comments scrolling beneath the video were a torrent of anger, disbelief, and support. His name, a hashtag, a symbol. Clarence leaned back in his chair, his body heavy with fatigue. The house, once a haven, now felt like a cage. He was trapped, not by physical bars, but by the weight of his position, the burden of his race. He thought of his grandchildren, their bright eyes full of hope and innocence. What kind of world were they inheriting? A world where a man of his stature, a Supreme Court justice, could be subjected to such blatant disrespect, such casual disregard for his dignity? The phone continued to buzz, a relentless chorus of the outside world clamoring for his attention. He silenced it, the sudden quiet a stark contrast to the noise that filled his mind. He stood up, walking to the window, staring out at the darkness. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale disk in the inky blackness. He thought of the long road ahead, the fight that had been waged for generations, the fight that still needed to be fought. The exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but beneath it, a flicker of resolve remained. He wouldn't be silenced. He wouldn't back down. He would continue to fight for himself, for his family, for all those who had been subjected to the same injustice. He would use his voice, his position, his experience, to shine a light on the darkness, to expose the cracks in the system, to demand change. He turned away from the window, a new sense of purpose settling in his heart. He would face the storm, not with anger or resentment, but with the quiet dignity that had carried him through 72 years of navigating a world that often saw him as less than human. He would face it with the wisdom of experience and the strength of his convictions. He would face it as Clarence Wilton, Supreme Court Justice, a black man in America, demanding to be seen, demanding to be heard, demanding to be treated with the respect he deserved. The quiet of his study, usually a sanctuary, felt oppressive. Clarence Wilton sat in his worn leather armchair, the scent of aged paper and pipe tobacco doing little to soothe the tremor in his hands. He stared at the video playing on his laptop, the flashing blue and red lights painting his own face in an unsettling strobe effect. He saw himself, calm, composed, a lifetime of practiced restraint holding back the tide of bitterness that threatened to consume him. He saw Cutler, young, brash, the casual disdain in his eyes a reflection of a prejudice Wilton knew intimately. He'd faced it down in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in the hushed whispers of hallways. But here, on a dusty Alabama road, it felt raw, visceral. This boy, he thought, doesn't even know what he doesn't know. The video ended, the silence amplifying the ringing in his ears. He closed the laptop, the click echoing in the stillness. He hadn't slept since the incident. His mind replayed the scene endlessly, each iteration a deeper exploration of the fear, the humiliation, the simmering rage. He'd spent his life dismantling these very prejudices, brick by painstaking brick, and yet here he was, another statistic, another hashtag. The weight of it pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of weariness. But a deeper, more familiar feeling pulsed beneath resolve. He knew what he had to do. The community center in Selma buzzed with anticipation. Clarence Wilton, a son of Alabama, a beacon of hope, stood before them. The air thrummed with shared history, with the echoes of marches and speeches that had shaped the very ground they stood on. He looked out at the faces, a tapestry of ages, backgrounds, experiences a reflection of the very struggle he was about to address. He took a slow, deep breath, the scent of fried chicken and sweet tea mingling with the nervous energy of the crowd. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of expectation, but he also felt a surge of strength, drawn from the collective hope in the room. He adjusted the microphone, the small metallic screech cutting through the murmur of the crowd. He didn't need notes. This story was etched into his very being. "I didn't come here to talk about what happened to me," he began, his voice resonating with quiet power. "I came here to talk about what's been happening to us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He saw heads nod, eyes well with unshed tears, fists clench in silent agreement. He spoke of the insidious nature of prejudice, the way it burrowed deep into the fabric of society, poisoning minds and warping perceptions. He spoke of the fear, the frustration, the exhaustion of constantly having to prove your worth, your innocence, your humanity. His words weren't accusatory, but they were unflinching. He spoke not of individual failings, but of systemic flaws. He didn't seek vengeance, but justice. He challenged them not to react with anger, but to respond with action. "This isn't about one officer, one incident," he continued, his voice rising in intensity. "This is about a system that allows such incidents to happen, time and time again." He saw a young woman in the front row, her eyes fixed on him, a mixture of pain and determination in her gaze. He saw an elderly man, his face etched with the memories of struggles past, a flicker of hope rekindled in his weary eyes. He saw himself, reflected in the faces of his community, his own exhaustion replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. The applause that followed his speech was deafening, a wave of sound that washed over him, carrying with it a collective catharsis. He felt a hand on his shoulder, a firm, reassuring grip. It was Deputy Morales. "You did good, Judge," Morales said, his voice thick with emotion. Wilton nodded, a small, tired smile gracing his lips. He felt a profound sense of connection, a shared understanding that transcended words. He knew this was just the beginning. The video continued to spread, a wildfire of awareness igniting across the nation. News channels dissected the incident. Social media platforms erupted in debate. Clarence Wilton's words echoed in living rooms, in classrooms, in the halls of power. The incident became a catalyst, a focal point for a long overdue conversation. People who had previously remained silent now found their voices. The demand for accountability, for change, grew louder. The pressure mounted on the police department, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truths within their own ranks. Cutler, suspended and facing disciplinary action, sat alone in his apartment, the silence broken only by the incessant buzzing of his phone. He scrolled through the endless stream of comments, the vitriol directed at him a stark contrast to the adulation he'd once imagined for himself as a police officer. He felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He'd thought he was upholding the law, maintaining order. Now, staring into the abyss of public opinion, he saw the ugliness of his own actions reflected back at him. He saw not a hero but a villain. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. He'd lost his way, lost his sense of self, in the murky waters of prejudice. Morales, on the other hand, felt a surge of pride he hadn't experienced in years. The promotion to sergeant was a validation of his integrity, his commitment to justice. He'd always strive to be a good officer, to serve his community with fairness and compassion. He'd seen the darkness, the temptation to succumb to the easy path of prejudice, but he'd always resisted. He knew that true strength lay not in wielding power, but in wielding it justly. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he also knew that it had to start somewhere. And for him, it started with that dusty Alabama road, with a simple act of doing what was right. Clarence Wilton, back in the quiet sanctuary of his study, felt a deep sense of peace. He knew the fight wasn't over, that the road ahead would be long and arduous. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his community, his history, his unwavering belief in the power of justice. He looked out the window, at the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. He thought of Selma, of the faces in the crowd, of the hope he'd seen rekindled in their eyes. He knew the seeds of change had been sown. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that they would bloom. The late afternoon sun, filtered through the blinds of his chambers, cast long stripes across the mahogany desk. Clarence Wilton sat, the weight of his office, of the very institution he represented, settling on him like a familiar robe. He ran a finger along the polished surface, the faint scent of lemon oil a comforting constant in a world of shifting sands. He thought of Alabama, the heat radiating from the asphalt, the dust motes dancing in the blinding glare. He thought of Cutler, the young officer's face contorted by anger, the words venomous. The memory, even now, left a bitter taste in his mouth, a phantom pressure on his chest. He picked up the letter, its cream-colored stock a stark contrast to the legal documents that usually cluttered his desk. The handwriting was neat, precise, almost hesitant. A woman's hand, he guessed, the loops and curls hinting at a careful, considered nature. He unfolded the single sheet, the faint scent of lavender rising from the paper, a whisper of domesticity in the hallowed halls of justice. His eyes scanned the words, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the meaning sunk in. "I saw that video," the letter began, "and for the first time in my life, I understood something I never had to think about." He paused, rereading the sentence, letting its weight settle in his soul. Understanding. A small word, but in this context, a monumental one. He had spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous currents of racial prejudice, a lifetime of coded language and veiled threats. And yet, this simple statement, from a stranger, felt like a crack in the dam, a tiny fissure in the wall of ignorance. The letter went on, detailing the writer's experience growing up in a small town in Ohio, a world far removed from the realities of his own youth in segregated Mississippi. She wrote of her initial disbelief, her struggle to reconcile the image of a Supreme Court justice being treated with such disrespect. Then came the slow, painful dawning of comprehension, the realization of the pervasive, insidious nature of bias. "I saw my own father in Officer Cutler," she confessed. The same quick temper, the same assumptions, the honesty of her words, the vulnerability they exposed, resonated deep within him. He had often wondered if his ordeal had been in vain, if the humiliation he'd endured had served any purpose beyond the momentary outrage it sparked. This letter, this unexpected confession, was an answer, a whisper of hope in the darkness. He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. He closed his eyes, letting the words wash over him, a balm on the still tender wounds of memory. Cutler had resigned, a small but significant victory. The news had reached him just a few days ago, a curt message from the Alabama State Police. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a terse notification of the officer's departure. Cutler, young, impetuous, his career barely begun, had been felled by his own prejudice. The irony wasn't lost on Clarence. He thought of the fear in Cutler's eyes when Morales arrived, the sudden shift in power, the realization that his authority had been built on a foundation of sand. He had seen that same fear before, in the eyes of sheriffs and senators, governors and judges, men who wielded power like a weapon, until they were confronted with the fragility of their own position. Morales had been promoted, a deserved recognition of his integrity. He had called Clarence personally, his voice thick with emotion, expressing his shame at the incident, his pride in serving alongside a man of such stature. "You are a true gentleman, Judge Wilton," he'd said, the words ringing with sincerity. "A credit to us all." Clarence had accepted the compliment graciously, but inwardly, he felt a weariness settle upon him. He was tired of being a symbol, tired of carrying the burden of representation. He longed for the anonymity he had enjoyed before his appointment, the simple pleasure of walking down the street without being recognized, without being judged. He opened his eyes, the faint glow of the setting sun painting the room in hues of orange and gold. He picked up the letter again, rereading the final paragraph. "The video went viral," she wrote, "and people are talking. It's not enough, not nearly enough, but it's a start." He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, close to his heart. He thought of the countless others who had witnessed the incident, who had seen the raw, unfiltered display of prejudice. He thought of the conversations sparked, the uncomfortable truths brought to light. He thought of the slow, arduous process of change, the incremental steps towards a more just and equitable society. He rose from his desk, the weight of his office, of the very institution he represented, feeling a little lighter now, a little less burdensome. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. He walked to the window, gazing out at the cityscape, the lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. He thought of the letter writer, a stranger in a distant town, connected to him by a shared moment of understanding, a shared hope for a better future. He knew the road ahead would be long, the struggle far from over. But in the quiet of his chambers, in the fading light of day, he felt a flicker of optimism, a fragile ember of hope burning in the darkness. The fight continued, he knew, but tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, a moment of gratitude for the small victories won, the small glimmers of light in a world still shrouded in shadows. The silence in his chambers was broken only by the faint hum of the city, a symphony of human lives intertwined, each one a story waiting to be told, each one a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of adversity. The low hum of the air conditioning unit was the only sound disturbing the quiet sanctity of Justice Wilton's chambers. Late afternoon sunlight, filtered through the heavy drapes, cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the rich mahogany desk and the rows of leather-bound legal volumes that lined the walls. Clarence Wilton sat in his high-backed chair, the worn leather soft against his back. He held a simple notepad in his hand, the cheap paper a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. His pen hovered over the page, the weight of the past few days pressing down on him like the heavy robes he wore in court. The image of Officer Cutler's sneering face, the blatant disrespect in his eyes, played on repeat in his mind. It was a familiar scene, a scene he'd witnessed and experienced countless times throughout his 72 years. But this time it was different. This time the world had seen it too. He closed his eyes, the phantom pressure of handcuffs still lingering on his wrists. The humiliation, the raw, visceral fear that had momentarily gripped him, he could still feel it. Not fear for himself, not exactly. He'd stared down bigger demons than a small-town cop with a badge and a chip on his shoulder. His fear was for the countless others, the young black men who wouldn't have the weight of his title, the protection of his reputation, to shield them from the potential consequences of such an encounter. He'd spent a lifetime fighting for justice, chipping away at the wall of prejudice brick by painstaking brick. And yet, here he was, a Supreme Court justice, still subject to the same indignities he'd fought so hard to eradicate. He opened his eyes, his gaze settling on the notepad. He slowly, deliberately, began to write. Power, he penned, the words stark against the blank page. He paused, the silence of the room amplifying the racing thoughts in his head. What did power truly mean? Was it the authority vested in him by the highest court in the land? Was it the respect he commanded, the influence he wielded? No, he realized it was something more profound, something more fundamental. Power, he thought, wasn't about wielding authority, but about using it to protect those who had none. It wasn't about demanding respect, but about earning it through unwavering integrity. It wasn't about influence, but about using that influence to uplift and empower those who had been marginalized and oppressed. He continued writing, adding to the sentence, power means protecting the powerless. He reread the words, letting them sink in. The incident in Alabama, the viral video, the ensuing public outcry, it had all been a stark reminder of the deep-seated prejudices that still plagued the nation. It was a reminder that the fight for equality was far from over. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this wasn't just about him. It was about every black man, woman, and child who had ever been unjustly targeted, profiled, and discriminated against. It was about the generations who had come before him, who had endured unimaginable hardships and fought tirelessly for the rights he now enjoyed. It was about the generations to come, who deserved to inherit a nation where the color of their skin didn't determine their destiny. He leaned back in his chair, the setting sun casting a warm glow across his face. He thought about the young Clarence Wilton, the boy who grew up in the segregated South, who witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of racial injustice. He thought about the fire that had ignited in his heart, the unwavering determination to make a difference. That fire, he realized, still burned within him, stronger and more resolute than ever. The silence of the room was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He closed his eyes, the weight of his position, the weight of history, pressing down on him. He was a Supreme Court justice, a symbol of hope and progress. But he was also a black man in America, a living testament to the ongoing struggle for equality. He knew that his every action, every word, was scrutinized, analyzed, and dissected. He knew that he carried the hopes and dreams of an entire community on his shoulders. He opened his eyes, a renewed sense of purpose filling him. He had a responsibility not just to uphold the law, but to use his position to advocate for justice, to speak truth to power, to be a voice for the voiceless. He picked up his pen and continued writing, adding a new sentence beneath the first. Justice is not blind. It must see the unseen, hear the unheard, and protect the unprotected. He knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous. He knew that there would be setbacks and disappointments. But he also knew that he couldn't give up, that he wouldn't give up. The fight for equality was a marathon, not a sprint, and he was in it for the long haul. He looked out the window at the cityscape of Washington, D.C., the heart of American democracy. The lights were beginning to twinkle, illuminating the monuments and memorials that stood as testaments to the nation's history, both its triumphs and its tragedies. He thought about the words he had written. Power means protecting the powerless. He knew that those words weren't just a platitude. They were a call to action. They were a reminder that true power lay not in the hands of the powerful, but in the collective will of the people to demand justice and equality for all. The fight was far from over, he knew. But with each small victory, with each act of resistance, with each voice raised in protest, they were chipping away at the wall of prejudice, brick by painstaking brick. And one day, he hoped, that wall would finally crumble, revealing a nation truly built on the principles of liberty and justice for all. He whispered the words to himself, a quiet affirmation of his commitment, his purpose, his unwavering belief in the power of change. Power means protecting the powerless.